What's up, guys? My name is Fari, and I build systems that remove bottlenecks within businesses. And I've been documenting my builds for 131 days now, going all the way up to 365. And in today's video, we're going to be going through how I organize everything that I learned, starting from why I do this and going on to the problem that I'm actively solving by doing this, as well as the core system that I'm using to basically build, this knowledge base that I use for extraction of different ideas and also learnings as well, and how this ultimately flows, as well as the high level value that this ultimately creates as well. So if we're jumping straight into why I basically do this, we can see that most people forget insights, never consolidate them, or rely on scattered notes. And this used to be me. I used to focus a lot on, hey, I'm just gonna make a note, and I'm gonna remember where this note is gonna be into the future. And also, some people forget insights. You may wake up at 2 a.m. in the morning and forget, and have an idea and ultimately forget that. But ultimately understanding that if you have somewhat of a way or a means in order to capture that insight, so you're able to then implement and execute on that insight, then you're then able to get a lot further, because you never know which insights will ultimately push yourself forward, as well as your business or whatever you're building as well. And ultimately understanding that having more structure as well is ultimately gonna allow you to win a lot further, because in as much as you can handle scattered notes and never consolidating all your lessons that you're actively learning, you can only do it for so long before you realize that this is an inefficient process. And this is what I realized, and this ultimately led me to understanding that this is a flow sequence where you ultimately have knowledge that is scattered, which ultimately results in you not being able to capture leverage through that knowledge that you haven't been able to consolidate and structure in the right way, that ultimately allows you to then build this leverage moat as well, through insights and different ideas that you may have. And also this results in you having slow growth, simply because you're not then able to consolidate or have a structure in terms of how you're capturing information and also executing on that information as well. So if we go into the problem, we can see that the challenges that ultimately play or are evident without having a hub is that ideas are lost in PDFs, notes, or screenshots. So you basically cannot understand, hey, if you're looking for one idea that you wrote in 2015 or 2020, you ultimately have to scour through all your PDFs, notes, and all those things in order to get that insight. And understanding that without this hub, you're basically scattered, because your knowledge is all over the place. It's not consolidated into one specific area that you ultimately have all your learnings and your failures and every single thing that you've learned along your journey. It's all scattered through screenshots and PDFs and notes, and that is not efficient, especially when you're now starting to scale and you have a lot of moving parts in your life as well, and as well as your business, because ideas can't compound, meaning that there's no repeatable leverage, or you can't repeat the leverage that you're ultimately able to create, because your ideas cannot compound. You don't have this central hub that ultimately allows you to then compound your ideas and the way that you execute them in the manner that you ultimately need to and also are doing in this moment in time. And understanding that it's hard to reference when needed for projects or systems. You ultimately have these ideas and you say, hey, one of the past learnings that we had from this specific project or thing that we built, you're looking for it when you're now taking it into a new project that you're building, or a new product that you're building, because products live forever and projects have an end. And understanding that when you're building products and you're building, you ultimately need to understand how you've structured your knowledge, because those learnings, you need to be able to extract that. And how are you going to extract that if your knowledge base is all over the place? And this efficiency ultimately compounds over time. You cannot expect to be running this system, or it's not even a system, but like running this process for an extended period of time and not think that it would compound, because so many things come as a result of compounding actions that ultimately result in the things that you see today, and understanding how do you stop this Swiss cheese model, where ultimately, like how Swiss cheese ultimately has holes, and then going through all those holes leads to some event happening. Understanding that, if you're then able to plug those holes before they ultimately happen, then you're able to then identify where you need to improve as well. And understanding that, without this hub, you ultimately are facing scattered nodes, scattered screenshots, and not having a core system that ultimately allows you to extract your knowledge base. And this is where I took the approach of, how can I build this knowledge base, which I ultimately call my Fari's OS, my operating system. And this operating system, how I basically went about it, is that the structure is like this. I have my notes slash capture, where I write quick ideas, notes, insights, basically all the different notes that I have, and I also categorize them. So saying, hey, if I have a note in the middle of the night, or an idea in the middle of the night, then I just go into my OS, then I ultimately use this note so that I can reference it later on into the future, as well as my base knowledge, my knowledge base slash library, where I basically categorize by topic. You see different books, articles, frameworks, or PDFs, or whatever the case may be, as well as podcasts, because you hear so many things, or you may hear one thing from a podcast, or one sentence or one line that ultimately changes your frame of thinking, which has happened countless of times for me as well. And also reading books, you may read a sentence and you'll be like, oh, this is the one thing that I've been missing all this time, and that ultimately shifts the paradigm for you. And if you're not then able to capture this and also categorize this as well in terms of your knowledge base, or having this knowledge based system that ultimately allows you to then capture ideas, and also different things that ultimately allow you to scale your level of thinking, then you then not able to capture or create leverage through this. And this leverage ultimately comes from you being able to pick out the knowledge that ultimately is applicable in the specific product that you're building in that moment in time, because some principles that you may have, or you may read about in that moment in time, or in the past, will ultimately transfers through time, or will ultimately stay consistent through time, like their timeless principles. And that is also important as well. And it's one of the things that I also take a very strong approach to, which is understanding that there's some timeless principles that can be applied in different industries, and understanding those timeless principles and capturing them as well is ultimately the modes that I also want to make sure that I'm incorporating each and every single build, in terms of what we're building, and as well as my knowledge base as well. And understanding that projects slash experiments are where you basically link your knowledge to real-time world implementations, basically being able to understand that you're then able to link your knowledge into the applications of the real world things that you're building, as well as building a cadence of daily slash weekly reflections, where you're then able to do pattern recognition, spotting different patterns that you've come across in terms of books, podcasts, or whatever medium it may be, and then highlighting the actionable ideas. Which ideas are you ultimately going to take action on, and are also applicable to what you're doing in this moment in time, and are also fitting how you view the world as well, because it's so important to also be able to contextualize it as well, which we're going to dive into the next one, where we basically understand the context aspect of it is also as important. But this means that you have tools as well that you can ultimately utilize, and these tactical tools are basically your Notion database for linked pages, tags, or topics, and different interconnections, basically using Notion as your central hub for all your knowledge ideas and different things that you may need into the future. And also understanding that templates also act as a mode for reoccurring note types. So if you write, or you have a certain way of capturing notes and capturing ideas, you can ultimately create a template through that, and have a dashboard that ultimately allows you for fast navigation and search as well, because you ultimately need to be able to find your notes or whatever ideas you've had as quickly as possible. And for me, that's also something that I think is super important and has been important for me. I may not remember the exact date in terms of when I wrote that idea or when I had that idea, but certain keywords will ultimately come to mind when I think of extracting that certain principle or framework that I need in that moment in time. So that's where having that easy navigation and having that dashboard is also as important. It's always the small things that you can never fully neglect, but ultimately play a role into that compounding mode that allows you to then create the leverage that scales your knowledge base and your level of impact as well. Because the more knowledgeable you are, the more impact or the more leverage you're then able to create. And if you're then able to consolidate this into a system that ultimately is super tailored for you as well, that allows you to have different ideas, extract them, and ultimately apply them as well, then you ultimately then going to be able to increase your impact that you're going to have within your personal life and your business as well. But this means that it has a flow, and this flow basically goes like this. You capture the ideas, you capture the different frameworks that you ultimately have, and from there you're then able to then consolidate them. So basically have them into one specific place that you can find or you can extract from and also apply as well. But also understanding that with this you need to be able to contextualize. If you're not able to contextualize what this actively means and having context for this specific principle or idea, then you're not able to then utilize it in the manner that you're supposed to. But that also means that through that you then apply. Once you're then able to contextualize it, then you apply this knowledge that you've ultimately been able to get, and through that you ultimately review, having that loop of saying, hey, I've captured these ideas, I've consolidated them, and I've contextualized them as well, because context is as important as well. And then you apply them, and through that application you then review on a cadence of, hey, say a daily, a weekly, whatever the case may be. And that ultimately allows you to run this loop of understanding how this ultimately flows. But through this you ultimately understand that there are two things: there's inflows and outflows that ultimately play a role in this. And these inflows basically come as a result of books, podcasts, articles, and conversations. Like I mentioned before, for example, one of the things that I actively want to build, and I should have done this a long time ago, to be honest with you, is with the conversations, with the daily conversations, the special guests that we've had, extracting principles that I've learned from them as well, and ultimately use that in the newsletter or something of that nature. I think that would be something worthwhile trying out, and finding different patterns as well, like I mentioned in the beginning, pattern recognition, and ultimately finding things that are common across those conversations, and the lessons that are also applicable as well, and sharing those as well. But also understanding that there are also outflows that ultimately play a role in this, and these outflows are content creation, so newsletters, videos, podcasts, those mediums, and systems building, basically building out the projects or the products that we're building for our clients or even for us as well, and the decision making mode of it, which ultimately allows us to then teach as well. Understanding what are the outflows that we ultimately want to have, and these are the things that are visible on the outside but aren't the things that are seen internally or seen outside. Sorry, it's part of a reference from a video that I made when I was talking about the visible results come from the invisible things that we do on a day-to-day, and understanding that there's inflows and there's outflows. I normally just add processing, but for this specific instance I just want to focus mainly on the inflows and the outflows as well. Just understanding how these both interact with each other, but understanding that one of the most important things as well is understanding that through this you need feedback loops, and these feedback loops involve you revisiting old notes and linking new experimentations and iterating on thinking. You cannot just iterate on the products or the way that you're executing, you also need to implement or iterate on the things that allow you to then think of new ideas as well. If you're not iterating your thinking first before you iterate your execution, then you ultimately using the inverse of it. You're executing and iterating your execution, but you're not iterating on the thing that actively powers that execution, which is your thinking. And understanding through this, you then ultimately understand what the meta principle of this is. And this is ultimately understanding that knowledge doesn't stay stagnant, or doesn't sit stagnant. It compounds with use. You ultimately need to make sure that each and every single day you're actively using this knowledge base, and you're using this experimentations and different things that you've ultimately captured into this one system, and you're ultimately utilizing this as well as somewhat of your source of truth. And through this source of truth, you're then able to compound it with use, and using it each and every single day then ultimately allows you to have these high level value, which are basically your outcomes. On a personal level, you basically get faster decision making. You can make decisions faster simply because you've been able to have a better framing and principles that ultimately guide your way of thinking and making decisions as well, because you've also documented that as well, which is also super important. And understanding that connecting ideas across projects as well is a result of that, because then you able to have pattern recognition, which I've mentioned a couple of times, and also reduced mental load, where you basically focused a lot more on building, simply because your knowledge base and your ideas and context is all consolidated into one place. And when you're then focused on building, because you don't have that mental load, then you're then able to say, hey, I don't have that mental load, but if I do need certain principles, or to extract certain principles and frameworks, you're then able to do that seamlessly, because you don't have to scatter all over the place looking for, hey, where's this document, where's this and this and that. It's all consolidated into one system that is super tailored to you. And understanding through this, there's also the tactical leverage, and this comes from ideas, your content ideas, your business systems, your frameworks all emerge organically, because you're then able to have this resource knowledge base that ultimately comes as a result of the things that you've then learned through time. And this means that everything learned becomes usable, reusable capital. And reusable capital is also as important, because you ultimately have this as leverage. You have this as your moat to ultimately reuse the things that you've been able to build, and also scale the level of impact that those things have into the future. Which also means that through this, you then have another layer, which is the high level insight, which ties all of this up together, which is that the hub itself is a force multiplier for thinking, building, and scaling systems. One of the most important things when it comes to building systems and building things that ultimately scale your level of impact is ultimately it acting as a force multiplier in the things that you're already doing, acting as a force multiplier in the inputs, as well as the way that you're doing your day-to-day things that ultimately compounds through time. Asking, how can this compound through time? It may not be immediate, it may not be something that you see straight away, but ultimately understanding that this is a mode that's ultimately going to compound my level of impact, or your level of impact, through time, and ultimately scales the impact that you'll have, is the way to go about it. And this is one of the most important things as well that I believe sometimes gets overlooked in terms of organizing what things you're learning, what things you're failing as well, because it's good to ultimately learn different ideas and extract things that you're doing well at, but it's also as important to learn from the things that you get wrong. And for me, I've learned most from the things that I've gotten wrong, rather than the things that I've gotten right. And that is what has been somewhat of a forcing function in order for me to create how I organize my knowledge in every single thing that I do, and just making sure that I'm iterating on my thinking and as well as my execution through this, so that it acts as a personal force multiplier. And if you guys enjoy this video, make sure to check out my newsletter that I recently just rolled out. I have my first post that I recently post, and I'm going to be posting each and every single week, so make sure to check that out if you're interested in that. And also, if you want to connect with me, X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.